What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my first impressions of Wolong Fallen Dynasty, a dark fantasy action RPG set in the Three Kingdoms period of China. Now, right at the beginning of the video, this one is a little bit weird because the release of the game is tomorrow. I did get a review copy. However, I got it roughly 14 hours before this video was going live. That is to say, right before the embargo lifted, which wasn't really enough time to do a proper review. So instead, I'm dropping my first impressions for the embargo. Though having just wrapped up Chained Echoes, the previous game I was working on, this game has my full attention now. And with the little bit of a head start, hopefully the full review won't take too terribly long, but there's that info for you. From there though, let's actually talk about the title. First impressions wise, playing on PC in particular, the first enemy you're going to have to fight is the controls of the game. This will likely be less of an issue for people using a controller, but the keyboard and mouse controls are particularly terrible, which is an issue that is compounded by the way the game sets up the tutorial and how the button prompts are actually presented. And between remapping all of the keys and actually figuring out what some of these button prompts were referring to. In many cases, it was a dual button press that was presented in a very strange manner that would allow me to perform what the game calls fatal strikes, or even just use some of the other abilities, which are naturally very important to the game. And not being able to sort that stuff out made the beginning of the title much more difficult than it needed to be. Which brings me to my next point. The game has had a demo available for a while now, and I would highly recommend you check that demo out before you pay for this game, because this type of game is thoroughly not for everybody. It took me probably 3 or 4 hours to really get the hang of it on top of the wonky controls, but once I got past that, I started having a lot of fun. In particular, I had to get the mechanics around parrying down, because parrying is a really big deal in this game. Dodging is just about useless for anything that isn't a regular enemy, and for bosses, you need to be able to parry their big moves precisely to fill up a gauge that will sort of break their guard and allow you to perform a devastating hit on them. And until you get that part of the game mastered, you are going to have a bad time. But if you can overcome that hill, the game does get so much more interesting and a lot more fun, which kind of reminds me of a similar experience I had with another game called Outward, where the first few hours were brutal until it kind of clicked, and suddenly I was having a great time. Realistically, I think those are the most important things to know before you buy this game. So from there, let's talk about some other stuff. When you fire it up, there is a character creator. You'll be able to customize your individual hero. There were a lot more options here than I was really expecting there to be, honestly. And the game uses a proper color gradient to pick out things like hair color, highlights, all that stuff. So visually, you can make just about any character you want, but at the end of the day, that's pretty much just cosmetic. And afterwards, we are thrown into the game proper. After a short cutscene where we save someone from being attacked by essentially bandits, we can start running around and hacking our way through enemies. Story-wise, I'd be lying if I said I understood the specifics, but basically, there are several warring factions, some of which are using dark magic to facilitate their assault on the other factions, but for the most part, you're just trying to survive, and the story takes off a bit from there. No spoilers for the moment, though. But very quickly, you'll need to come to grips with the controls as you are thrown into combat fairly quickly. Now, the beginning of the game, the first sort of mission you're in, is a small area that is very much so a trial by fire. You cannot go anywhere, you cannot do anything until you clear the small route up to the boss and then kill that boss. The boss is pretty challenging, there's no hand-holding here, you just have to figure out how to kill this boss. And while the game does introduce things like co-op and bringing in NPCs even to help you in various missions, none of that's available until you clear this prologue. This prologue is also my understanding what the demo consisted of, but I didn't check that out personally. And I say that because I imagine the game is going to lose a lot of people right here. But I do think this part of the game is important because until you learn the mechanics required to beat this boss, you're just not going to be able to handle the rest of the game or even the next area. So let's actually talk about some of those things as well as the features that come after. First and foremost, combat and equipment pretty much revolves around the 5 affinities at the basic level. Every time you level up, which is done by gaining resource from killing enemies, you'll take that back to a battle flag, which is essentially a place to rest. Doing so heals you up, but also respawns most enemies, kind of Dark Soulsy, and once you have enough, you can level up at these flags. Doing so will allow you to raise one of your 5 affinities. Each is associated with a bunch of derivative stats, which will increase your effectiveness at various things. But the 2 most important things to keep in mind here are what you are raising is deciding what weapons you're going to be good with, as well as what wizardry you can use. Wizardry is self-explanatory, it's spells, but we'll get to that. Each type of weapon that you are using has weapon scaling based off of these affinities. Ideally, you want to be using a weapon that is scaling with the affinity that you are raising. So first and foremost, I would check which kind of weapon you want to be using, so you can start raising that affinity, which brings us to the wizardry. This is, of course, just various spells you can cast. You can have up to 4 of them equipped at a time. However, in order to use them, you have to have the appropriate level of affinity for the wizardry. Now, you can learn these pretty much all at once. Every time you hit a sort of milestone, you'll be given the ability to learn a few spells for each affinity. However, you simply cannot use the ones that you don't have a proper affinity level for. So you'll be able to learn them, you just won't be able to use them. So just make sure you're actually assigning your slots to wizardry you can actually use. Now, the other caveat to this is the morale system. As you fight enemies or are potentially defeated, you'll be raising your morale. This is a sort of in-the-moment power level. Enemies with a higher morale than you will block and deflect your attacks more easily, and the higher your morale versus theirs will make things easier for you and increase your ability to deflect their attacks. This is particularly important for bosses, regular enemies not as much. Now, every time you die, you'll be sent back to one of your battle flags that you last used with a lowered morale. It won't necessarily drop all the way to 0 though, which is where fortitude comes in. The more flags you place throughout a given level, the more minimum morale you will always have in that area. This is important because the game largely uses an almost mission-like structure. At each flag you can travel to various battlefields, they call them, which are functionally little levels that you can explore. Your progress in these areas is permanent, but some of them are required, of course, to advance the story. But ultimately, the higher the morale, the better, and it is possible to increase your morale further by defeating enemies. But the fortitude minimums keep it from getting too out of hand. Then we have our martial arts. Every weapon you have equipped has potentially up to 2 martial arts available for you. These are effectively special moves that you can use with that weapon, and depending on the quality and rarity of the weapon you have, even these can change a little bit. But ultimately, the weapon you're using, the martial arts associated with it, and the wizardry you have equipped are going to form the bulk of your build on top of your stats. Now, all of that stuff affects your deflect difficulty. Deflecting is effectively your parry, and while it's not a huge deal for the regular enemies, as you can mostly just spam attack them to death, for bosses, deflecting is everything, as I mentioned, as this facilitates the fatal strikes, which are going to make your life a lot easier. Now, once you figure out all of that, which this video just told you, and you get used to doing it, the combat gets a lot better. Again, for me, this took a couple hours to really get the hang of, but after I understood all that, I was having a good time. Now, if you find yourself struggling here, one of the places you can travel to or one of the battlefields is a training area that will walk you through this stuff step by step. And it's actually that training area that made me realize the button prompts for keyboard and mouse were simply not presented well, because the training battlefield will not move on until you perform these attacks the right way. So I was able to realize that the way the button prompt was being shown and what I was doing clearly weren't lining up. So if you're on keyboard and mouse, just keep that in mind, I suppose. But even still, there are a few other things I wanted to mention. As I stated earlier, there is co-op and things available, so you will be able to play this game with others. But barring any real-life friends, you can also bring along some of the companions that you'll meet. Some of this is story-related. And as you move through missions with some of these NPC companions, you'll unlock access to divine beasts. Basically, if you perform really well in combat and fill your divine gauge, you'll be able to perform a sort of in-the-moment summon, which can either buff you or just deal a damaging attack potentially to an enemy, though you won't have access to the divine beasts until after the prologue, and a little bit into the next battlefield. A little further still, and you'll even get access to a blacksmith who will be able to upgrade your equipment and weapons. This will do things like increase their affinity scaling, which will of course be very useful. When you first meet the blacksmith, they can only do sort of small upgrades for you, but just from some of the text and descriptions in game, eventually it sounds like you'll get access to a forge where you'll be able to do more like socketing jewelry debris, as well as even some transmog by the sounds of it. All of that, systems and everything included, is to basically explain that I'm glad I didn't give up on this game after just a couple of hours, because while that would have been easy to do, I think I would have missed a lot of fun to be had, because once I got past that sort of hard learning curve at the beginning, the game got a lot more interesting, even if a lot of it isn't presented in the best manner. But with combat in particular, which is, as you might imagine, kind of the big focus here, once you master the basics, it can be a lot of fun. There's a lot of weight to it. If you are not paying attention, it's easy to get destroyed in just a few hits, and while you do have a healing item you can pop, most things can kill you very quickly if you're not paying attention. And outside of bosses, this is mostly true in reverse as well. Combine that with the sorts of spells you can get a hold of and use, and it can be a lot of fun. You can even use a bow, which is difficult on PC, to be honest, but it's available. But all of that kind of makes the combat have this real weight to it. And at the end of the day, if you die, you're just going to get sent back to the battle flag for the battlefield that you're currently in. So for someone like myself who enjoys a pretty systems-dense game, a lot of that is on offer. The combat is pretty fast-paced once you get the hang of it. You can start taking down enemies in a pretty spectacular fashion, but nonetheless, the game does have some faults. As I've stated pretty thoroughly here, the beginning of the game is rough. The PC controls in particular are really bad. In terms of the technical side of things, only thing I really noticed here was a single crash to desktop out of nowhere, and then every once in a while the FPS would just dip when I was in a more open area, but even that was seemingly random. And that, I think, is where we are going to leave this first impressions video. Overall, looking forward to reviewing the rest of this game. I don't know how long that's going to wind up taking, but basically after getting to grips with the combat system as well as its satellite systems, I'm having a blast after a very rough start to the title, which I'm sure will make for an interesting review overall. So if you're looking forward to the review, or if you just enjoyed this video, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of all that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.